Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome Professor Samba Gadjigo. He's a French teacher at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. He's also a filmmaker. His recent documentary is called Ousmane Sembene. Mr. Professor Samba, thank you very much again for joining me on the Human Rights Tree.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and congratulations for the work you are doing. And I hope we'll produce an interview that will further interest for your organization and for mine.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Basically, the goal in my goal having this interview is to talk about Ousmane Sembene, his work, and
Mhm.
to talk also about the man behind his work. And
Right.
I know along your journey, you did have the opportunity to meet the man and know him. But before we start talking about Ousmane Sembene, I would like to know a little bit about you as a filmmaker, as a professor.
Yeah, I mean, before getting to those two things, like filmmaker and a professor, of course, I am originally from Senegal. I'm from Senegal Oriental, where I was born and grew up in the mid 50s. That's very, very important to note, meaning I went to school in 1961 after Senegalese independence, but still our curriculum, our textbooks were French textbooks. So we
Yeah.
did not know about African history. We did not know about African culture. We were completely brainwashed into the French culture. I mean, I'm not rejecting the French culture. I'm not rejecting any culture, but it came at the cost of, if you want, erasing our own culture. So it is within that context that when I went to high school in the 70s, I encountered Ousmane Sembene's work, which was a kind of very important change in paradigm. Before that, I was being fed with French textbooks, and Sembene comes to show me there are African languages, because the subtitle of his 1960 book is Bantimam Yalla, meaning the book is written in French, but with the subtitle in Wolof. The importance of African languages, importance of African culture, but also most importantly, importance of African stories. Because what's happening in any education, whether it is the Arabic or it is the French, who are being offered stories maybe about Africa, but that are written by other people. And the Semben stories are African stories about Africa by an African and in Africa. So that was my first encounter with Semben when I was in high school. That was in the mid 70s, actually, yeah, the early 70s, actually, 1972. And then, of course, as you may know, going to university in Senegal, we hardly touch on Sembène, or we hardly touch on Jibril Tamsir Niane, or all the African writers or filmmakers. So it's ironically, it's only in the United States when I arrived here as a graduate student that I discovered really Sembène's works.
So take us a little bit back as a child growing up in Senegal Oriental, especially in Kidira.
Mhm.
Uh, can you tell us about your family background? Because we know in Senegal there are the Wolof, there are the Tukulor, the
Mhm.
Mandinke, and can you take us in that environment growing up in Kidira in Senegal Oriental?
You know, it's so difficult for me to say I'm Fulani because I am what they call Laube, meaning woodcraft. When you read Sheikh Anta Diop, you will see the Laube are said to be originally from Guinea. We don't have any specific language. We take the language of the community in which we live. You see what I'm saying? So
Yes.
I would say I grew up in what we would call a multicultural environment. Kidira sits at the border between Mali and Senegal, and only about 40 miles from the border with Mauritania in Bakel. What did that mean? It meant that as soon as you open your mouth as a child, you are speaking 3 languages. You are speaking Halpular, you are speaking Bambara, which is the national language of Mali. You are speaking Soninke, which is one of the national languages of Mauritania. So, and then, of course, in that village, you have Fulani, you have Bambara, you have, how do you call it again? You have all the ethnic groups. I am Laube. We had a lot of Subalbe, for instance, fishermen. We also had Soninke. We had the Bambara. Anyway, so really, we did not have that concept of separating ethnic groups or languages. We grew up within that mold where you are raised, you are grown up to see the world through the prism of multiculturalism. So that, and then of course, at the time, we did not have any newspapers. Even the radio, we had the radio only at night, shortwave radio, because we were 600 kilometers from Dakar. Actually, it's ironically, we were more exposed to Radio Guinea and Radio Mali than to Radio Senegal, which we got only at night. And as I said, we did not have radio, we did not have television, we did not have newspapers, but we had a certain outlook on the world from the stories told by the elders. I was raised by my grandmother, as you may know. I mean, during the day, before you go to school, you are going, if you are a fisherman, you go into the fish with your father. If you are a farmer, you go farm with your father. If you are a laube, you go wood carving with your father. And then at night, you have storytelling. So our entire worldview, our perception of ourselves, our perception of the world around us, and our perception of our relationship with that world was coined or shaped by the stories we were told, until we started going to French school when the narrative completely changed. And
Go ahead.
No,
How
go
was the curriculum? After being in that African environment, being raised by your grandparents, they taught you about your culture. They taught you about your father's profession, and after that, you end up in school, and being being covered into learning of French curriculum. What changed?
Oh, a lot changed. First, you said the French curriculum. The French curriculum was supported by the French language. You may not know this, but people of my generation, and or you can see it in many narratives. You take Camara Lies, L'Enfant Noir, you take Cheikh Amidou Khan, L'Aventure Ambiguë, all that first generation. One of the things they all have in common is to tell you how, during that period, to enter French school was to completely adopt the French language, and even African languages were not allowed within the perimeter of the school. We had something called le symbole. It was a symbolic, it could be a match, it could be a piece of wood, which was meant to penal any child who was caught speaking Wolof, speaking Bambara, speaking Soninke, speaking Fulani, was given that piece of wood. At the end of the day, if that child was not able to give it to someone else, that child was submitted to some kind of punishment or some labor. The point is, our languages were excluded and criminalized. Imagine being deprived of the possibility to speak your language, your maternal language. It's being amputated of the part of your personality, of who you are. You may know English very well, you may know French very well, but there are certain feelings you can only express in your native language. So French education was first an obliteration of our native languages. A lot has been written about Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, has written about decolonizing the mind. Sembene in the 70s has fought for the imposition of language. In 1957, Sheikh Anta Diop had already studied a transcription of Wolof and so on and so forth. That's one, the language issue. Second, through the textbooks, we were being fed with French culture, French values. In geography, in Senegal, they rarely tell you about Mauritania or about Guinea. No, they're talking about the French Alps. They're talking about Marseille. In history, we are talking about the great French Revolution, the civilizing mission of France, and so on and so forth. So it's the storyline has completely changed. Through the oral stories of our grandmothers, we saw Africa from an African perspective. At school, when Africa was mentioned at all, it was from the perspective of the other. And that perspective was very politically motivated. It is to sell colonization as a civilizing mission. It is to sell France as a beacon of freedom, of hope, of civilization, whereas Africa is represented as a dark continent without culture, without past, and without hope. So you can imagine having been trained in that kind of educational system where it's what in French they call la depersonalisation. You completely lose your personality as an African. And yet the tragedy is that as a Black man, you will never be a full French. As M.S. Césaire from Martinique used to say, il y a des Français à part entière, il y a des Français à part entière et des Français entièrement à part. They are full-fledged French, and they have some special kind of French, which are the colonized French. So that's what it was like to be into that French. I mean, actually, Jallo, the situation has not changed a bit. You go to Guinea today, you go to Cote d'Ivoire, you go to Mali, you go to Senegal, still it is French language that is the official language. If you take, I don't know about Guinea, but even take the Constitution of Senegal. The Constitution of Senegal was completely a replicate of the French 1959 Constitution under de Gaulle. So that colonial relationship still continues.
Actually, I spent most of my time in Senegal, and when you refer to the symbol you wear at
Yeah,
school,
exactly.
I wanna say I did experience that because I went to École Primaire Koloban 2, and I recall during lunchtime we have the symbol with us, and you are not allowed to speak Wolof. And therefore, if you make a mistake, you speak Wolof, they will wear it. And it was like a cordon with a bone attached to it.
Yes.
So basically, despite I am younger than you, I went through that same process.
The
But
point is that nothing has changed.
yeah. So it's amazing that those stories are coming out. You went to primary school, I'm guessing in
Kidira.
Kidira, and further you went to at the University of Sheikh Anta Diop. How
Yeah,
was
before
the
that, I went to high school in Saint-Louis de Senegal.
Saint Louis was the former capital of Senegal? How was your experience in Saint Louis?
It opened my horizons because I was leaving one cultural area, as I said, Fulani, Bambara, Soninke, and I was going to an area which was dominated by the Wolof culture. And by the way, until I went to Saint Louis at age 12, I did not speak Wolof.
I see.
Yet I spoke Soninke from Mauritania, and I spoke Bambara from Mali, but did not speak Wolof, which is the national language of Senegal, because I was about 400 kilometers de Saint-Louis. So going to Saint Louis meant for me to learn, to acquire a new language, to go in a new geographical area. Kidira is in eastern Senegal, dry, very hot. And then I was going to the north, where the climate is a lot colder. Second, it was for the first time to leave my village at age 12. I had never traveled that far. So just imagine landing in a new city where you hardly knew anybody at age 12, and you had to adjust to that new environment. But the juicy part of it, it was my first time to be in a classroom where the teacher was white. My French professor was a white woman. That was my first time to be between four walls with a white person as my teacher.
How was
And
that?
being,
How was
hmm?
that experience?
I don't know, it not only the French teacher, but also, of course, when you go to high school at the time, you also meet children, other children from all the other regions of Senegal, right? Because Lycée, what was then called Lycée Faidherbe, was certainly one of the first high schools in Senegal, because as you mentioned, Saint-Louis was the capital of Senegal and actually of Afrique Occidentale Française, French West Africa, before it was transferred
Dakar.
to Dakar. So yes, it was really an opening of my horizons, coming up with different nationalities, because at Saint-Louis also you have the military school Charles Chorore, where many elite from other countries came for military training and military education. So Saint-Louis was, yes, a very important, a giant step in my education, if my in my growth of my, and then also, of course, you move on the educational ladder, because going to lycée, going to high school, is to move into the ladder of the French curriculum. But also the irony is that the higher you go into that French curriculum and that French culture, by the way, Saint-Louis was the first city that was, how to call, built by the French in Senegal. It was a repository, it was the anchor of French culture. So the higher you go into that culture, the more you leave your own culture behind you. The more you advance into French education, the more your own culture resides in the background. Basically, you become, I don't know, a Black Frenchman in a certain way.
Yeah, but there is an African saying that wherever you go, you will find a family. I'm imagining going to Saint Louis at age of 12. Did you have an adoptive family in Saint Louis, or you were just sent to go to school?
No, I was not in a board at the time. In the lycée, you had the boarding options. There's some
Okay.
interna, externa, meaning boarding school and the day schools. And ironically, the boarding school was meant to help children who are coming from, how do you call it, very modest families, backgrounds. In my case, I was not well, I was qualified, but I did not get the boarding school. So I was a day student. You know how it goes. It's connections. I mean, it came from Kidira. So my parents knew someone who is in Saint Louis, and you land in someone's house you had never seen before. You had never, but then at the time there was still a certain measure of solidarity. People help you. I mean, they give you food, they give you housing, and then you go to school. Yes, that solidarity played to a certain level, but you were also becoming a kind of burden for the person in whose house you are lending.
I see.
Mm.
We know the system, French system education purpose was to civilize the African because they think we were not civilized. In the process of going to high school, um, did you see yourself as a civilized French? And to that, did you see yourself more than the other Africans?
Uh, I don't know if I saw myself, maybe until I encountered Sembene's work. All I knew I thought French culture was the only culture worth talking about, that the French language was the only language worth talking about. And that is not the figment of my imagination, because there is no social mobility without, you can know 10 African languages. If you don't know French, you don't know English, you don't know Portuguese, you are not going anywhere, socially or economically speaking. So that is a price to pay for you to have that kind of social mobility. So becoming French or knowing French culture becomes a kind of aspiration for everybody. Okay, you can be as intelligent as they come. If you don't know that French language, you don't belong, basically. So whether or not I considered myself as French, for me, that was not the issue. The issue is that French was projected, was imposed as the only valid language for access to what is construed as knowledge, right? Like, you know French, then you know the world. You don't know French, you don't know the world. You know French, you have social mobility, you have degrees, you have a job, and so on. So you don't have those, then you don't have anything. So the matter is not whether you thought you were civilized, or certainly you think you are superior to others, because French language and French culture were projected to be superior. And if you master those, certainly in your society also, you are considered as superior.
So when did you graduate from high school, and when did you go to Dakar City to pursue
Okay,
your education?
I graduated, well, so I went to high school in 1967. Okay, so I did all my stuff until seconde première. It is my last year high school that I discovered Sembene's work. Gatsby's of Wood, Le Bout de Bois de Dieu, which we read. Now, mind you, 1972 is only 4 years after the events of 1968, which started in the United States, went all the way to Europe, and then ended up in Africa. The student and workers' unrest of the 1960s. What were some of our demands was, ironically, an Africanization of educational programs. An Africanization. The same way in the 60s, African American students, what they called Black students in the United States, also demanded, requested that Africa, their tradition, their culture be introduced into the curriculum. That's where in the late 80s, 60s, everywhere you go in the United States, in all the big universities, you have Black studies. That's how Black studies were born. So for us in Africa, 1968 was a shift where we were all asking for African programs. That's how I discovered Sembene. But then in high school, then you go to university, still the curriculum. I was in lettres moderne, meaning in the humanities. Still there, all our program was the French textbooks. It was a French novel. We knew more about Molière and Stendhal than we knew about Seydou Badian Kouyaté, or we know about Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or about Sembene Ousmane. And actually, you know, the University of Dakar, which is called today Cheikh Anta Diop, was created in 1959. In 1959, from 1959 to 1972, the University of Dakar was still considered as part of the French university system. Dakar was the 18th French university.
But how can you explain that phenomenon, considering the fact that Senegal was independent in 1960?
Senegal is not independent yet. We had the flag, we had the national anthem. In 1960s, the only country that was independent was Guinea, which took its independence in September 1958.
But the 1960 Senegal was not independent?
No,
60?
we are still not independent.
When Senegal was independent?
Well, maybe tomorrow, but right now we are not independent.
Okay. I think
You see what I'm saying?
but officially, I'm saying that Senegal in April 4th, 1960, Senegal was an independent country
Well,
on paper.
Yes, we got a national anthem.
Okay.
We got a flag. We
Okay.
got a president, but still, we are still not independent. Even today, if you follow what is going on in Senegal politically, we are still fighting for our independence.
Okay. So how was the movement inside the campus life, considering the fact despite
Mm,
Senegal was officially independent, the
mm,
university was part of the French educational system. How
mm.
did you react about that situation? Did you
Well,
just follow in trying to obtain your degree, or did you kind of protest and ask more um, that the curriculum being fashioned in the to take on the reality of African authors and African um, cultures?
yeah, I think both. Yes, of course, before you subvert the system, you need to survive within the system. Of course, we went to school, we learned the French textbook, but along the way, there was always activism for people to change the curriculum at the university. And maybe now, if you go to Lettres Moderne, you will find more African writers. But the irony, last year I was in Senegal, and I was talking to a high school student just asking, oh, what do you read in class de première, meaning in 11th grade, the equivalent? He said, oh, we're reading Madame Bovary by Flaubert, Gustave Flaubert, 2023 in Senegal. Even the French don't teach Flaubert anymore. And we're stuck, we're teaching, and our children are still learning Flaubert. So I think the liberation, I mean, that has been part of the struggle by Sheikh Anta Diop until he died. That has been the struggle of Abdoulaye Bachili until Abdoulaye Bachili still, many generations have been fighting for that. And I think we went backward since Macky Sall came to power 12 years ago. We are not progressing, we are going backward.
But what do you think about the saying of Leopold Sedar Senghor that colonization was a mal nécessaire?
I think Senghor is the one who kept us under the yoke of the French. Many things from 1960 to the time he left in 1980. Senghor only surrounded himself with French advisors. Senghor thought maybe French language is the only language worth speaking about, despite, yes, his work he did within the Negritude movement. I mean, he did not. I mean, where did he die? He died in France. After he retired, where did he go? He went to France. When his body was exposed at the Assemblée Nationale, what were the symbols on his coffin? The sword of the Académie Française. So Senghor sold us to the French, and we are still suffering from that legacy.
You see, you graduated eventually from the University Sheikh Anta Diop.
Yeah.
Um, did you stay in Senegal and um, trying to share your knowledge, or you find a path going
Mm.
to other countries? What was the situation?
No, I mean, I did my licence, my BA, if you will, and I did my master's, and I did École Normale Supérieure. And like everybody else, I started teaching in Senegalese high schools, which I did from 1980 to 1982. I was at Lycée Limamoulaye in Guédiawaye for 2 years. And
Okay.
then I had the opportunity, and in the mid-80s, many French departments in the United States broadened their offering to include Francophone countries, and the US universities, the French departments were recruiting graduate students from French-speaking Africa and from French-speaking Caribbean to be teaching assistants in the United States. So it is within that wave of the 80s that I came to the US as a graduate student. But before that, I had taught. I was a professor of French in lycées in Senegal.
So you went to the United States. When was it, and how was your experience as a newcomer in America?
Well, I think the first experience was to struggle to master a new language. Of course, like all of us, I learned English in high school, but it was some kind of bookish knowledge of the language. You know the vocabulary, you know the grammar, but you have never been in a situation whereby you communicate it in the language. Okay? So you come here to the United States, I mean, other than the French courses that are taught in French, the universities function in English, the society function. So it was again a new adventure. It was a new opening to the world by trying to function in a new language. Of course, the University of Illinois, where I attended, that I attended in 1982 in Champaign-Urbana, I mean, we had more than 100 African students from all nationalities. The university had more than 35,000 students. So it was really, yes, the world meets in the United States. So it was again another opening. It was a challenge, of course, of learning a new about adapting to a new culture, learning a new language, and of course other challenges, because you have big dreams. You came with this what they call the American dream, and you realize it is not, well, yes, the road is not just romantic, it also paved with a lot of challenges. The American dream that, oh yeah, once you arrive, you can do whatever you want, that's a myth that you have to face, you have to deconstruct through your lived experiences.
So
So yeah.
you don't mind sharing one of those challenges you face by
Yeah,
being
sure.
in
I
America?
came in the French department where 99.99% of the curriculum again was French textbooks. I arrived from Senegal, and my dream was to continue my quest of African languages and African literatures, right? So the first challenge is that how can I fit into that department? So I had myself to how to call it again? Yeah, to craft my own major, meaning expanded French studies, meaning what I was interested in was not at the center of the curriculum, it was at the periphery of the curriculum. It was an addition to that curriculum. The second, I come here with a master's from Senegal, and one of the first requirements was, oh, you have to redo the master's because our degrees are undervalued in the United States. You have the problem of equivalency. That also something. So that's a few of the challenges. But again, of course, despite what I said about the American dream, it offers also a lot of opportunities. You can study, you can work, you have a lot of intellectual resources. So you have a lot of academic, that's where actually, when I arrived in Illinois at the Africana Library, I was able to discover more African filmmakers, more African writers from North Africa and from Sub-Saharan Africa. So the irony is you discover more resources about Africa in the United States than you would discover in any African university.
I see. Living at that time in Illinois, Champaign, was it easy to be in touch with your family back home?
Well, again, it was in 1982. The fastest way to communicate was through a telegram, remember? Or maybe you don't remember that. We did not have a fax. Very, very privileged few had a phone. So you had to write a letter. At the time, it took about 2 weeks to take a letter from Champaign-Urbana to Dakar and then to have it into your village. Then you had to wait another 2 weeks. So it took a month just to exchange. Today, of course, at the click of a button, I'm in contact with my village through WhatsApp, through whatever it is. The situation was very, very different then. So, yes, you are completely isolated from Senegal. You hardly had any news from Senegal or about Senegal because, as you know, American television, if you take CNN, you take all these major channels, you only hear about Africa when there is a catastrophe. where there is a famine or where there is a war. So yes, coming from Africa, you are completely isolated. We were very, very isolated here.
So, as a African student living in campus, what was your interaction with different communities, such as African American communities, other people coming from all around the world? Was it easy? Your interaction, was it easy, or was it quite challenging for you?
Well,
Do
there was
do the fact
pleasure.
the way they perceive Africa?
Certainly, the big irony is that I was more open to students from other parts of the world than to African Americans who were here.
And why?
Well, I don't know if I had that answer because the situation is still the same. I teach now in a liberal art college. When you have African Americans, you also have Africans, but they don't even belong to the same organizations. So it was easier for me to make connections with white students who came from other parts of the world than to make connections with African Americans here in the United States. And I don't think the situation now, of course, I'm generalizing. Of course, there are few exceptions. There are exceptions, but by and large, African Americans and Africans have not made the connections they should have made in American campuses in the United States.
I assume that you went
But
through.
maybe one of the reasons, of course, African Americans are underrepresented in higher education in the United States. That's the truth. You find more young African Americans in jail than you find in higher education.
I see. So I'm guessing you went through school and you um, took the opportunities that were there, and you graduated and have your doctorate. After
No,
having your
you don't take the opportunity, you fight for them. It's not given to you.
yeah, but there is at least opportunities out there that you can
Absolutely,
take
absolutely.
advantage. Welcome back, Professor Samba. We were talking about you going back to school and in urban Champagne, and you says the opportunities that was given to you, but in same time you learn from the challenges you were facing. But I'm guessing at the end of the day you were able to finish your education and have your doctorate. What was your doctorate is about?
Well, as I said, I landed in a French department and with a project on expanded French studies, meaning Francophone. And I had devoted to my PhD dissertation exactly to a better understanding or exploration of the French educational system. So I wrote my dissertation on that. Actually, the dissertation got published later under the title École Blanche, Afrique Noire, l'éducation coloniale en Afrique. So that's what I wrote my PhD on because I wanted to have a better understanding of what fashioned me, what am I the product of, what were the intent, what was the shape, what was the content of the French colonial education, and how has it influenced, have it shaped many generations of Africans, including myself. So I did French colonial education for my PhD. And being part of the French department, of course, I was also looking for jobs in the United States because I knew at the time that going back to Senegal, I did not have any job guarantee there. There were very, very, very few universities at the time in 1986 when I graduated here. There were very few universities in Senegal, so there was no job prospect for me coming from the United States with a PhD in French. So naturally, as I said, in the 80s, many French departments were opening up to the French-speaking world. So that also had an influence on the staffing right, on hirings. So that's how I landed a job in 1986 at the institution where I am, Mount Holyoke College, which is a whole woman school in how do you call it? Yeah, in
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts.
What is the title of your dissertation again?
Ec- euh, que- L'éducation, attends, l'enseignement colonial français à travers l'autobiographie africaine. Meaning, I explored French colonial education through autobiographies, meaning how Kamara Lai, Sheikh Amidou Khan, Bernard Dadje related their own experience being in French colonial education. What was the content of that education? What was the structure of that colonial education? Of course, also doing research with secondary sources. And then when this PhD, when it was completed, I published it in French at Édition L'Harmattan under the title of École Blanche, Afrique Noire.
École Blanche, Afrique Noire.
Afrique Noire.
What was your founding after the whole that whole
Well,
process?
certainly, I was not interested in the French colonial education per se. I was interested in exploring how that French colonial education, which was tied to the colonial experience, which was to serve the colonial interest, how that same colonial education had been kept in Africa. Whereby the title École Blanche, Afrique Noire, meaning the programs do not reflect our African experiences. They do not reflect our African languages. They do not reflect our African culture. They are not meant to develop Africa, but just to alienate us to better serve the needs of France. That's what I was interested in. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, you go to Senegal today, you go to Guinea, you go to Mauritania, you go to Cote d'Ivoire. It is the same system that is continuing.
Yes, but when you found out through your studies, when you found out about the impact of French educational system on us, and you believe that this is not the path for us to go, what are the solutions you come up with?
The solution is to turn more towards Sembene and toward African writers. I use the French language, but I'm not teaching French literature. I have not taught French literature in 30 years. What I use is the writings of African authors in French for a better understanding of Africa. Of course, you are going to tell me that the French language is still there. You are absolutely right. But at least I'm looking at Africa from an African perspective, through African writers, through African filmmakers, through African cultural activists. That's the big change. Until the day when we start teaching in our schools and universities in African languages, this is, if you will, the list of bad situations. And of course, the situation is also changing. As you know, Ngugi from Kenya is writing his novels in Kikuyu. Sembene did his films in Wolof and in Bambara. Suleiman Sise is doing his film in Bambara. Gaston Kabore is doing his film in More. So the landscape is changing.
I see.
So it offers some windows. Today, you can have a complete outlook on Africa, its past, its present, and future, just by screening Samben's films, just by watching Gaston Cabore's. So, yes, the language is still there, but I completely changed the culture. I am teaching right now. This semester, I taught 2 classes. One class is Introduction to the French-speaking World. What do I teach? Senghor, Césaire, Damas, David Job, and Birago Job, and the films of Sembene, the films of Med Ondo from Mauritania, the films of Earthen Palsy from Martinique, and so on and so forth. So yes, if this language is still, how to call, a straight jacket, within that language, we coined a space to allow the entry of African cultures. So that's what I do.
So, when did you graduate, and when did you start your job in Massachusetts?
I graduated in 1986, and I got a job in Massachusetts the same year in 1986. I studied here in September. No, what I'm saying. Yeah, I studied here. I was hired in June 1986. I started teaching in September 1986, and I have not moved since then.
Through your studies,
Mhm.
basically, you went on trying to study the French educational system in Africa. And through your founding, you believe that system is not working for the African, and we need to find another way. When you start teaching, did you try to implement
Mhm.
your ideas into your teaching? Did you
Oh,
try to um, implement those ideas? And if you did you have any challenges implementing those ideas? Because, of course, we have a French department and they have expectations too. So, did you
no,
have a conflict implementing your new ideas? Of
not actually. I would say yes or no, because if you are hired to teach the French-speaking world, the space is already there. It depends on what you put into that space. So I use the space I was offered to implement my own vision as a professor. I mean, that's the charm in the United States. Nobody tells you what to teach, right? So you have all the space, you have the academic freedom, of course, within certain limits, to teach what you are hired to teach without anybody breathing over your neck. So from 1986 to now, nobody ever imposed on me what to teach, and my specialty has been Africa and the Caribbean.
I
And
see.
that's what I teach. Today, I expanded. For instance, I was saying I taught a course on introduction to the French-speaking world, but I just finished teaching a whole seminar on Ousmane Sembene's work. From day one to the end of the semester, all the seminar has been centered around Sembene's work.
I
And I
see.
had 12 students who saw all the films, read most of the books, and all the seminars are discussions about. And the students are very, very enthusiastic about it.
About his work.
Of course.
I would love to continue the discussion, but in some time, I am aware about your time.
Yeah.
So I will end this conversation uh, for this episode today.
Yeah, we can
And
talk about
I look
next week.
forward to talking about Ousmane Sembene next time, as
Okay.
you brought
Well,
the
this
issue.
was maybe it was a long, but yes, it was a nice introduction, just so lay the background.
Yeah,
Or we set the stage for talking, because Sembene is my passion. Sembene is my mission, because I think he did a lot he contributed a lot to a renaissance of African culture and African cultural expression. So yes, let's set an appointment for next week.
again, Professor Samba, thank you very much for joining me under the Human Rights Tree. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much. And talking actually, when I went through your website, I found it's very, very. I also published something about Sembene and human rights, which, of course, Sembene subverts the paradigms of Western individual human rights to introduce a people's rights.
I would love to hear about that, and I will love also to read about your piece.
Okay, great, great. Thank you very much. So we'll talk next week then.
Well, thank you, Professor Samba.
Okay, Jallo, merci.
Merci.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.